All right, well, welcome back. Sorry that it's taken me so long to get these last lectures up. It's just been an incredible burden. I'm sure you understand. A lot of things have to go up online. It takes forever to load up. And unfortunately, a lot of the Latin American lectures I hadn't yet made up. I was making them up as I went along, which is my plan for life in general. I always figured, okay, well, I have to have it by this week and by this week, and then suddenly you added all this enormous burden of having to record it, edit it, and load it up online. And so anyway, that's my butt covering there. Excuses for being a substandard teacher. I hope you can understand. But I did want to get you guys into the 20th century. I had to cut back a bunch on the 18th century. I had another lecture I wanted to give on the 18th century on sculpture, and retablos and retablos mayor and other things, and I couldn't do it. I had to cut something. So we need to get us into the 19th and into the 20th century to at least kind of close out the class, and I probably won't get nearly into Chicano art as much as I would like. It's just a reality of it. So again, my apologies. Let's talk about the 19th century. So the 19th century is most significant because this is, of course, the period of independence for most of Latin America. All of this is touched off by the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon goes into the Iberian Peninsula, and this starts off the Peninsular Wars, which basically has France on one side and Spain starting out on the side of the British there, but eventually a puppet government being set up under Napoleon. And this causes the collapse of the House of Bourbon. Remember that the House of Bourbon already had suffered a terrible blow because of the French Revolution, just a decade earlier. And so this was the absolute end of the House of Bourbon. And because of all the craziness going on in Spain, this naturally caused all of the holdings of Spain in Latin America to revolt. This had been a long series of declines. The House of Bourbon had increasingly become more strident, and increasingly there had become more and more French rule over the region and French influence, and the French were rather contemptuous of Latin American sensibilities and rights, and so it was inevitable that this was going to head to conflict. So we had a series of wars for independence that lasted a very long time. The Wars of Independence take a very long time, and they're not neat in any way. They're rather messy. There are fits and starts. Mexico takes several different times to establish its independence, and the history of Latin America is not really an easy one. In America, we've had one civil war since our founding, and pretty much one constitution and one government since that time. We're now, I think, in the Fourth Republic for Mexico, so they can't beat the record for most republics. That goes to France. But there's a reason why the political history of Mexico and Latin America parallels the kind of chaos in France, because it's the same kind of thing. It's a collapse of a monarchy. It's a collapse of a monarchy and a decision of whether we're going to have a new monarchy or whether we're going to have a republic, and Mexico went through all of those decisions. Likewise, Mexico suffered several different interventions, twice by the French and once by us. As I'm fond of reminding everybody, if you're still in Utah, you are standing on territory that was once part of Mexico. It was part of Mexico right up until 1849. So it's a long and complicated history. And you can see that Mexico is the first. It's the first to break. That makes sense because Mexico is kind of the cultural center of New Spain. Peru follows right after, as does New Granada. Granada becomes eventually Colombia, Venezuela, those regions. And then ultimately you have Gran Colombia, which is kind of this country that exists for a short period of time, which is ruled by Simon Bolivar, who was the liberator of that region. But Peru and the provinces of the Rio de la Plata never quite joined up with the idea of Greater Colombia. And then eventually Colombia broke up away from Venezuela, and we have the independent nations as we do today. But it's a very complicated history. It all kinds of starts with a couple of radical priests. We have a couple of radical priests. Hidalgo is probably the first and the foremost, but there's also Morelos, and a few others. And taking advantage of this disunity that exists in the Spanish Empire and genuinely protesting the terrible treatment, particularly of natives, of mestizas, he went and he rang the church bell, and this is the Grito de Dolores. He makes a proclamation that starts off the revolution. Here we see a rather romantic portrait of him from 1905. And you can see him carrying the banner, and we still actually have the banner. Notice that the banner is the Virgin of Guadalupe. So this character, this image, which had become the image of the Catholic Church and the image of the natives. Remember, this particularly was an image given to Juan Diego, who was a full-blooded Indian and has all of this native Aztec and Mexica imagery. It became the rallying point for all of this, and continues to be this important image today. It's also interesting that it started off with the Catholic Church, because remember that the Catholic Church saw themselves initially as the defenders of the natives, and so saw them as the people who were there to, in a kind of paternalistic way, raise the natives up in the new religion. And so these priests, it makes sense, are the ones who ultimately sparked off the revolution. When we take a look at the imagery produced by this, revolutionary imagery is going to be very prominent throughout the 19th century. Portraits of Simón Bolívar, and also portraits of Father Hidalgo and Iturbide, and other individuals are going to be very, very prominent in the iconography. For the most part, this iconography is going to borrow from European iconography. You can see that Bolivar here has his hand in his jacket, which is something that he borrowed, the artist at least borrowed, from an affectation of Napoleon. So there is going to be this kind of appreciation. But these figures become iconic figures in their own right. Here we see, in this case, Hidalgo crowning a figure representing the liberty of the new state. It's not an accident that we have a very French-looking person over here being pushed to the side with the chains. The chains are being liberated. So we have Hidalgo on this side, and we have Iturbide on this side. The figure here is carrying a staff that has a Phrygian cap. This is a standard symbol of the revolution, of the French Revolution. So the idea of the French Revolution. But the headdress that the individual is wearing is a Mexica Aztec headdress. And so there are features of native. When you take a look at the style of this, the iconography is obviously European, but the style, of course, represents a kind of nativist style. And so nativist styles and nativist themes are going to be very prominent in art of the 19th century. And what's funny is that despite Hidalgo and Iturbide becoming very prominent figures in the iconography, they both came to rather sticky ends. Hidalgo himself was killed in the first year of the revolution. He was tried for heresy by the Spanish Inquisition and killed, executed. Iturbide became the first emperor of Mexico, but then was overthrown in a coup 2 years later, which established the First Republic of Mexico. He went away to Europe for a while, but came back, and then he was summarily arrested and executed. Later was elevated as a great hero because he was the general that started on the same side of the Spaniards, but ultimately came to the cause of this nativist revolution. So both of them will figure prominently in revolutionary imagery, as will Bolivar. Bolivar actually gets a whole country named after him, Bolivia, and is seen as this kind of force of a liberator. That's going to be some of the major themes going forward. As far as art goes, well, the 19th century is an extraordinarily turbulent period. The art more or less parallels the experience of France. It's kind of an amazing thing that you have these royal academies being established in France in the 17th century, and in Vienna, and in England in the 18th century, and the Academy of San Carlos was established in Mexico City 1783. That's really very early for a royal academy in the New World. There had been earlier schools of thought, etc., but this was the first royal academy. There had been an academy that existed prior to this for engravers and makers of medallions. So by the 18th century, there was a long-established neoclassical style, and of course, this is the period of French influence, so it's going to be this very high academic style. Even though this was a royal academy, it actually survives the revolution and continues, hardly a heartbeat lost. It's kind of amazing. The same thing happened in France. In France, you have the Royal Academy, survived the revolution. They destroyed every other institution of French life, including the church. They tried to get rid of the church, but the Academy of the Arts, no, we can't touch the Academy of the Arts. And so the same thing happened here. And so the dominant style for most of the 19th century in Mexico and Latin America is going to be a neoclassical academic style. You can see this in the portrait of the first director, Manuel Tolsa, and also in the arts of other individuals. Here we have a portrait. This is the vice protector of the Academy of San Carlos, and this again, ultimately very classical. You can see that we have a person back here who is obviously a person with long hair, who's a person of native descent, and we have a person here who is very clear of European descent, teaching them from a classical image. And then we have two children who, by the poverty of their clothing, are very clearly meant to be mestizos or possibly Indians. Notice that they're not shod, they have torn clothing, but they do have like portfolios and drawing implements under their arms. So this is a very fascinating painting because it shows the Europeans in a paternalistic, one would say patronizing role of educating natives. It's a little racist, there's no doubt about it. This is still the same era as the casta paintings as were being painted here, so it makes sense. So this is the role that the Academy takes on, as a role of bringing European heritage to the New World. And what's surprising is so much of the revolution and the independence movements are about extolling native views and native beliefs, but they do so in the spirit of the European academies. It's kind of interesting that caste laws were becoming increasingly strict. As I mentioned before, in theory there were all these laws forbidding the mixing of the races, and all these casta paintings demonstrate the complex nuances of this multi-ethnic, multi-racial society. But the evidence of the paintings themselves, as well as the evidence of society, suggested that it was a lot more complex than we realize, and that there really, this was against the law for this racial mixing, but there was nothing keeping people from doing it. But the evidence is that this actually increased during the 19th century. This is a fascinating thing, that in theory the new revolutionary government came in and wanted to get rid of casta, wanted to get rid of all of these limitations that had been imposed upon them by the Europeans. But strangely enough, the social institutions, the academic institutions, all became more European over the 19th century. It's really kind of a paradox that the revolution, which was supposed to elevate the status of the mestizos and the natives, actually empowered the European descendants, the Creoles, who were themselves very much tied to this European heritage. I think this comes from a kind of inferiority complex. This happens a lot in societies, and quite frankly, you see the same thing in America. That in North America, when we were building our own indigenous architecture, our own kind of nativist style, when we decided to build Washington, D.C., how did we build it? We built it in the style of a European capital. We went and got Pierre Lafont. We got a French designer to go design the capital for us. So it's that same kind of idea. Europe was the center of culture, and even though Mexico was, quite frankly, wealthier than wealthier than Spain itself, you have this kind of envy, this kind of inferiority complex that pushes native Mexican artists and native Latin American artists to extol this European style. And you can see this in the works of artists who are producing under the Academy of San Carlos. First and foremost, one Cordero, Cordero does this wonderful piece. And this piece actually was presented, I believe it was presented in Paris. And so it was exhibited in Paris. And so here we have Christopher Columbus returned from one of his expeditions, and here he is presenting natives. Now, the natives are shown as deferential to the king and queen. King Ferdinand is shown with a look of kind of, wonder on his face. But it's not accidental that we have all these blonde and blue-eyed and fair-skinned people back here, and separated from the natives here. The natives are shown as dignified, and they're models in terms of their body, their anatomy, their face. They're really largely European, but they are, of course, darker skinned. But they are shown with the traditional clothing and arrows and other things. So they're very romanticized, but still there is a hierarchy here, and the hierarchy is that the king rises to acknowledge his new subjects, but they are kneeling to him. The idea being that authority emanates from the European source. We see same things in sculpture. So this is a very famous sculpture that was made at the time by Manuel Villar, and in this case this is Tlahuicole. This was a general of the Tlaxcalans, and the Tlaxcalan general fighting in a form of gladiatorial sacrifice. And when we look at his face, his thin mustache, his hair, the quality of these aspects, these are the things that indicate that this is a native person. But as I said, and notice that he is in fact tied to this post. So if you remember back when we talked about the Aztecs, how they were tied to these posts, and this was an incredible way of sacrificing. But his torso, his depiction, his bulging veins, owes more to the Laocoon of Hellenistic art than it does to any kind of native style. So this is an attempt to translate the existing native themes into the European idiom. And you have to give them credit that at least they were trying and allowed to take the myths of their own people and to elevate them in the same way that the myths of the Greeks and the Romans were elevated into this style. But stylistically, this is purely taken from the European experience. Same thing. But there are so many of these that are nativist in style. So there's a very, very strong nativist element. This one is Obregon. This is the discovery of pulque, as this is a drink made from the maguey plant, which is this precursor to, tequila. Tequila is made from the maguey plant. So this is this alcoholic beverage. And so here we have this maiden who was the discoverer of it and is presenting it to the Aztec emperor at the time. And so we have things like the canted walls, details that are meant to look like they are Aztec. We have these characteristic faces and features, the darker skin. Excuse me. The darker skin. We do have the correct crown on the head of the individual here, but mostly, despite being peppered with themes and details that indicate we are purely a pre-Columbian scene here, it's largely this European academic scene. So in this case, this is the maiden Xochitl offering it to the Aztec emperor Tecpan Caltzitzin. And so this is this famous story from Aztec mythology about the invention of this alcoholic drink, which was then used in their rituals and many different processes. So it's a very important piece of native history. But artistically, it really, really says it's mostly from the sense of the academy. And so it is, I think, in a way, a kind of act of courage to demonstrate the atrocities of the Spaniards. This is very much a way of trying to create a sense of a national identity against the Europeans. Felix Parra did a whole series of these paintings, which are called Episodes from the Conquest, and these were actually awarded at high awards at the Exposition of Philadelphia in 1876. This one, of course, is a depiction of Bartolomé de las Casas, who made this very impassioned plea on behalf of the natives, and so we see him here in a gesture of veneration to God and also grief, with the temples being destroyed, the garlands and the old gods being cast down. But we also see the woman pleading at his feet and the dead warrior, indicating that we are seeing this passage into the new Christian era, but it comes at great cost. We see other series and examples from this. This is another episode of the conquest. This is the massacre at Cholula. So Cortez, in his conquest, actually went to Cholula, and one of the worst acts of the conquest, one of the most atrocious acts of the conquest, he fell on the leaders of the city and slaughtered them all. And so you see the men bleeding into the street, the blood filling up the cracks of the stone, the men in armor, and they're also looking at jewelry and other things that they've clearly taken off of the bodies. The women mourning over the dead children in a state of mourning, the old idols knocked over. And aside from a few things such as some of the native artifacts and some of the architecture, most of this is pure European tradition. So there is a reflective quality to this. We see this also in the works of Leandro Izaguirre. This is the torture of Cuauhtémoc. Cuauhtémoc is the last leader of the Aztecs. He was the nephew of Moctezuma, and after Moctezuma was killed in the Night of Sorrows, in the slaughter in the main plaza, in the main temple, you have Cuauhtémoc comes to power, and he bravely tries to put forth a resistance, but ultimately fails. And so it's interesting that in all of these cases, with the exception of the Catholic Church is always kind of given an exemption. The bad guys are Europeans. Universally, they are shown as kind of brutes, as torturers, and it is the natives who are shown as ennobling. Nothing of the sacrifice of humans, nothing of the atrocities of the Aztecs are shown. Instead, it all focuses on the atrocities of Europeans. So you got to give them credit. This is a very, very brave stance to take in art of the time, and very much about establishing our native identity, that we were a great nation before the Europeans came. But in terms of style, it's utterly European, aside from the pastiche of certain elements, architectural elements, door frames, here the crown of the Clajeone, all of these things are just kind of pastiche. And so it's something ironic about it. There's something ironic about extolling the greatness of your nation and your past history in the cultural idioms of the culture that destroyed you. It's certainly conflicted, shall we say. And this is going to be a source of major contention going forward into the 20th century. That the first round of independent Mexican artists are doing this to reclaim their heritage, but they end up having a break with the modernists in the same way that we see that same break with modernists happening in Europe. But the modernists in Europe are breaking mostly stylistically. They're breaking from the tyranny of the Academy. They're breaking from the stylistic tyranny of the Academy. But when we look at the modernists that arrive in Mexico and Latin America, it is much more racially and politically charged than simply a break in style. It is not just the tyranny of style they're going on. They're going against this concept of Europeanism. And this is in many ways the argument of modernism in the Latin America. One of the reasons modernism really takes off in Latin America in the early 20th century, perhaps even better than it takes off in America. In North America, it takes modernism a long time before it kind of gels into people's bones and they accept it. But Latin America, modernism took off very, very quickly because people interpreted it as a refutation of Europeanism, of not just an academic style. But of course, again, as I have to say, this doesn't happen so much in America because the Native Americans in the United States were merely pushed to the fringes, pushed to reservations, and they were not integrated in society. But if you are a Mexican, chances are you are mestizo. You have a descendancy from both European and Native. And there are still lots of natives, people who are purely Native Mexican, or Mexica, or Mixtec, or whatever. And so modernism is more than just a repudiation of style. It is a repudiation of the whole conquest. And the argument of modernism in Latin America is a bit different than it is anywhere else, because in other places the argument of modernism is, oh, we're tired of those, fuddy-duddies and their stuffy style and their elites. In Latin America it is, we are going to assert our own identity, and we're going to go look back to our native tradition for it. And we see the primitivism, which also was happening in modernism, not just as, hey, primitivism for Picasso, primitivism for Matisse, and all those other people. It was just a fun toy. It was something they could play with to try and find something that was more spiritually meaningful to them. But for Latin American artists, primitivism is a return to their culture. It is a return to their identity in opposition to the imposed European identity of the academic style. So it's a lot more complicated. Now, they do have, one of the things that's really interesting is there is a kind of vibrant, both impressionist and landscape movement that develops in the second half of the 19th century. And I can just touch on the great, and that's Velasco. Velasco is the greatest of all of these. Velasco is trained by an Italian painter who is teaching at the Academy of San Carlos. So he comes out of it. And he starts doing paintings like this, which is the Valley of Mexico. And so here you can see the Great Valley as it extends out. Notice that it's equal to these grand kind of academic visions of landscape. You have the very clearly identifiable landscape and mountains that surround the Valley of Mexico. It shows its natural beauty and clouds. It's really gorgeous. But at the center of it, he puts a small a cluster of individuals, a dog, a boy, and their mother. They're clearly wearing native dress, bringing this into a kind of narrative, making it fundamentally about this native experience. It's really kind of a beautiful scene. But while he starts off in a more academic style that's clearly being influenced by the Hudson River School and other artists on the North American continent, he moves more and more into direction towards Impressionism. But the Impressionism of Velasco is never going to be a kind of... And this is where, again, things matter. Things matter more in Latin America in this way. When Monet is painting haystacks, he again is making an argument about style. That I can paint these spontaneous haystacks, or when Pizarro is painting countryside or train stations or whatever they're painting, the Impressionists are painting things of real life. But when Velasco is painting, he paints the land. And it is the land that is so important because the land has been in contest. The land has what has been the dispute. Who owns the land? And so it's not accidental that many of his works of art actually go back to historical sites. This is the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan. Notice that the top is a little bit steeper than we remember it today. Today it's about cut off there. So remember that this got totally redone. Manuel Gamio and a few others removed the top layer. So this is one of our best records about what this looked like. This is the Avenue of the Dead, and all of these pyramids are partially, covered. You are standing on the Pyramid of the Moon looking out to this. So this isn't accidental. I mean, I think there's... First of all, I think Velasco's a better painter than half the Impressionists. I think he's just better than most of the French Impressionists. Don't tell Courtney I said that. Don't tell Courtney I said that. But I do. I think he has a better eye. I think he has a better eye for composition. But there's something far more meaningful about a Mexican impressionist painting a scene of Teotihuacan and the Pyramid of the Sun than there is even in Manet painting Rouen Cathedral. Because the French, even though they revolted, their culture isn't in doubt. But for this culture, particularly going through the 19th century, this is very much in doubt. And plus, holy crap. Oh, this stuff is just gorgeous. The trees, his sense of light, his sense of competition, his sense of composition. Velasco is just one of the greatest artists that ever lived. I'll just go to the mat and say that. He really should be regarded not just as a Latin American painter, not just as a Mexican painter, but as one of the first-tier painters in all of human history. Certainly one of the great landscape painters of all time, and probably one of the greatest impressionist painters of all time. And he's not the only one. There's many others, but time forbids. So one of the other things that I want to talk about is this native painting. This will become very important because this will become very influential to later painters in the 20th centuries. When we talk about retablos can be used many different ways. When we talk about retablos mayor, we're usually talking about an altar screen, and that's usually the way it's meant. And the term for that can be reredos, it can also be an altar screen or a choir screen, something of that nature. They have many different names, but they're usually large standing altarpieces that stand behind the altar. But a retablos can also mean a small votive painting. And these are called laminas. They are also called ex votos. The more common term in Mexico is laminas, but also retablos. And the reason they're called laminas is because they're painted on tin. Tin was a common, cheap, available material. And so these are paintings by untrained artists, sometimes by individuals themselves. Sometimes these are painted by artists that are existing in a quasi-professional state. And these are paintings to commemorate protection by a saint or by the Virgin Mary. So in this case, what you're seeing is an individual here being shown twice. Here he is kneeling with his family before this traditional image of the Virgin Mary as a kind of offering, this very mountain-like form that we associate with the form of the Virgin Mary from Marcos and Potosi. And then this is the scene for which he is dedicating this, that he was gored by a bull in a marketplace. So he credits his salvation and his ultimate physical protection to the Virgin Mary. And to commemorate this, he gives an inscription below and then paints this scene here. Now, ex votos like this actually were pretty common in the Old World, too. I'll never forget the time I went to Siena and I saw a smashed helmet from a motorcyclist in the church there. And he had actually painted a little picture on the helmet. It was this broken helmet, and put it at the altar. You see a lot of these in Greece as well, where you can buy little stamped tin pieces of an arm or a leg or a heart corresponding to the part of your body or your life that was rescued by a saint. And this was a very, very popular tradition in 19th century Mexico. And it's still going on today. I don't want to paint, this is like I say, you talk about Mexico, there are very few actual pilgrimages that are ongoing in Europe today. Europe has become really rather faithless in its Catholic tradition. There's only diehards who are carrying out a lot of these old traditions. In southern Italy and Spain are the strongest, and in France very little. But Mexico is still a country of faith. It's still a country of a very deep, abiding Catholic faith, and pilgrimages and festivals are very much a part of its life. And so Stepingo into Mexico, I know this is kind of stereotypical, is a bit like going back 500 years in time to this. And so this is a living tradition. Again, as I try to remind you, a lot of these traditions are living traditions in Mexico. They never went away. They've always been present. Sorry, I knocked my mic over. I hope you didn't hear that, and now I'm having to set it back up, and it's all skiwampus. So you can see scenes here. This one was painted in 1893. And this one is from Signor Caterino Tovar, and he fell ill with bloody dysentery, and he goes to a shrine, and his wife offers up a prayer, and so this is him, commemorating that event. Here is another one painted on tin. Sometimes these are painted on tin, sometimes they're painted on copper, but usually tin. And this one shows a really tragic carriage accident. And here you have the crucified visionary kind of image, protecting it. Carriage and trolley accidents are just ubiquitous in these things. Oh, sorry for being a little bit morbid, but here's another one. Here's an electric trolley, and here's this woman thrown under an electric trolley. So you see a scene of several different scenes. You see a woman falling underneath a trolley and being damaged with a trolley. You see this woman, another child, invoking the Virgin. This is the Virgin of the Apocalypse, also known as the Virgin of Guadalupe, and the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception. And then another person praying at a bedside. So all of these things come together to kind of create a narrative. And this one you can see the tin appearing. Sometimes the tin is still is covered, sometimes it's not. So carriage accidents were common. So if you were saved by from a trolley accident, you would actually put one of these as a form of dedication. So this is a largely native form of art, of folk art, that is very, very popular in Mexico. The college that I worked at, the Sul Ross State, had a large collection of these ex-votos, and it's just I don't have a single picture of a single one of them. It's just absolutely depressing that I never arranged with the Museum of the Big Bend to have these done. I had a student who did her master's thesis on these, and they're really just they've become very popular in research now, but there's still so many of them. It's vastly understudied, and so you kind of have a conflict going on in Mexico, that on one level you have a kind of official art that's very academic, very high-end, being produced by people who are trained predominantly by Europeans. I mean, even Velasco was trained by a European. And they're competing at the highest levels in places like Paris, Philadelphia, New York, San Francisco. And they're doing very, very well. But in a way, it's kind of completely detached from the experiences of everyday people who are creating their own art. And it's this detachment that ultimately comes to a head when you see around the turn of the century a movement to a more native and expressive style. And a very important figure in that is going to be Jose Posada. So Jose Posada is a printer. He was a printer and a cartoonist and a caricaturist, and he started as an illustrator doing prints, but around the turn of the century he opened up his own shop, and he started to exclusively make his living off a series of broadsheets. And so here are these series of broadsheets. And he did all kinds of broadsheets, but he's most famous for his calaveras, his skeletons. And his skeletons are borrowed, again, from this Aztec imagery, from this Mexica imagery, and of course imagery associated with Day of the Dead. Now again, Day of the Dead, I know you've seen Coco, I know you've seen The Book of Life, and it's become very, very popular as a kind of form of cultural expression in the Mexican diaspora. But the Day of Dead was actually pretty localized to Oaxaca and a few other regions of Mexico. And it didn't spread past that in popularity until the 20th century. It was like, hey, here's this really unique thing that we do as Mexicans. Let's hype this to the stars. And so they did. And has a lot to do with this kind of Mexican diaspora. As Latin American people spread throughout the world, they want to keep their culture with them. This is why Cinco de Mayo is such a big deal in America, but it's not terribly a big deal in Mexico. Cinco de Mayo was a day where the people of Puebla, an army of Puebla, predominantly natives, defeated a French army. And that's what's celebrated. Many people in America think that that's the Independence Day. The Independence Day is actually in September, and honors that the Grito de Dolores of Hidalgo. And that's what they mark as kind of the moment of independence, and Hidalgo is kind of the father of the country for doing that. Cinco de Mayo was something that was a holiday in Puebla and was regarded as this kind of great victory, almost like given by God over a superior French force. But when the Chicano movement starts in the 1960s and 70s, a lot of those Chicano populations in LA were from Puebla, and took that as a new holiday. And then it spread, of course, to college students and Texans and other people who just wanted an excuse to drink. So it became kind of the Mexican version of St. Patrick's Day, which again, St. Patrick's Day wasn't a big holiday. It is now because Americans made it a big holiday, but it wasn't a big holiday in Ireland before that. So he's really responsible for kind of expanding this idea of this culture of the skeletons, the culture of the day. But he uses this for the purposes of satire. So here is the Calavera from Oaxaca, and you'll notice that he's a violent radical. Oaxaca's always been a center of revolutionary fervor and revolutionary spirit. It was one of the hot spots of the original revolution in 1810, and it became a hot spot of the revolution in 1910. The second, so you have the independence movement. The War of Independence is the war in 1810, and then you have the Mexican Revolution, which is the War of 1910. And so you have radicals, and so here he is, terrifying everybody, bloody knife. The idea being that he doesn't care about people, and you see that the whole realm of human life is being parodied. This is a parody in this case of this is the Calavera of the coyotes and waitresses. So here you have a coyote as a con man or a low-life criminal, and so this is a discussion of how in restaurants the waitresses and the con men would come in and take over people. And so this was, again, a testament to the reality of Mexico, that Mexico was a kind of violent place, that there were whole segments of society that had broken down. And so Posadas turned his attention to them. He even turned it to himself. This is the skeleton of his publisher. So this is his publisher here, and all of these people working tirelessly at the printing press or working are them. And this is him. This is him right here. So he has painted himself here, going in. And so the publisher, again, you have this incredible fervent spirit. The publisher has Arroyo's very, very typical beard and sunglasses and bowler hat that he wore everywhere. So here he's making fun of his kind of mannerisms, his kind of sophisticated mannerisms, and yet here he was making money off of these broadsheets that were being sold to the masses. So Posada becomes a kind of Thomas Nast. If you remember, Thomas Nast was an American cartoonist who's responsible for inventing, amongst other things, the image of Santa Claus that we know today. He popularized this idea of kind of a fat, fur-clad Santa Claus. He also popularized the images of the donkey and the elephant as symbols for the Democratic and Republican Party. And so what Thomas Nast did for kind of political cartoons in the United States, Posada did the same thing for Spain. Here is the great electric skeleton, and of course this was, of course, at the turn of the century, so we have the arrival of electric trolleys. But the electric trolleys, much like they did in America, came at great cost, destroying other industries and tearing up streets and causing much upheaval of traditional way of life. So you'll notice that the skeleton has like hypnotic rays of electricity that are emanating from his eyes, and you see the people being hypnotized. And of course, the action of all of these things is death. And we even get to criticize the revolution itself. So this is a critique of Francisco Ignacio Madero Gonzalez, and he was a writer and a radical and a revolutionary who eventually became the 33rd president of Mexico after the election in 1910, which was seen to be stolen and fraudulent. And so here he is showing him, and even though he was an intellectual, this is his characteristic beard, but here he shows him with a serape and a bottle and a sombrero. Madero often depicted himself as a man of the people, but he depicts him here as kind of a peasant, and the life is, that's the joke of it. And one of his most famous scenes is the Calavera Catrina. The Calavera Catrina has become a ubiquitous symbol of death. And again, this is kind of a critique of bohemian life in Mexico. We in America think of Mexico as poor, but particularly Mexico City, was very, very well off at the 19th century. It had prospered very well. And so here we have a woman, which is supposed to represent a native Mexican, but she's wearing a fancy hat in the native European style. And there's also a kind of joke with the fact of it being a skeleton, that there were women, this Calavera Catrina, this is a parody of women in Mexico who would use European makeup and European styles to disguise their native heritage, to put off their native heritage in a way. So I don't know. I don't know if a Katrina is the same as a Karen, but you get the idea. It's a parody of a kind of social stereotype that exists, and then you have all of these kind of other stereotypes or notions that are embedded within it. But eventually this becomes one of the most popular images in all of Mexico. Gorgeous stuff, fun stuff. And you have to say, I love his style. His style was very quick, it was very comical, but it was also very entertaining and really beautifully direct. So I was pleased to see that when they did Coco, you could tell that they were citing, every once in a while you would see a scene or a piece and you're like, they are deliberately copying Posada. Posada made the Calaveras popular, so it makes sense. So let's talk about Mexican muralism. So modernism arrives a little bit late in Mexico, just as it does in America. Modernism, at least as we understand it, this revolution that happens between 1910 and 1920, when you have this move, towards pure abstraction, that happens really in Europe, and so it makes sense that it happens a little slower here. But you also see this happen in Mexico because a lot of these artists were being trained in Europe. A lot of these artists go to Europe, they receive training in Europe, they see what's happening, and then they come back. The largest and most important movement then of modernism in Latin America has to be Mexican muralism. Of course, it's called muralism because it was dedicated to the painting of large-scale murals. The three big ones, Los Tres Grandes, are going to be Diego Rivera, Siqueiros, and Orozco. Those are by far the biggest ones. And here's where, again, modernism departs. Modernism is more important in Latin America than I think it is in Europe, even, surprisingly enough, because they used modernism in service of this revolutionary fervor and revolutionary spirit and reestablishing nativist identity. And so it becomes much more about identity than the Europeans. So a lot of the Europeans seem like they're just playing around for the fun of it. They're being radicals because it's bohemian and it's fun. But for Mexico, it's not about that because they had real serious issues. And it all starts with the Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution happens right at this time when all of these kind of radical movements like Cubism, constructivism, Dadaism are coming out of the woodwork. So right when all these radical ideas are emerging in Europe, Mexico is involved in a pure revolution. And the revolution comes in response directly to the rule of Porfirio. Porfirio Diaz was the president, but essentially he was a functional dictator of Mexico. From 1877 to 1880, then there was a brief interim, and then where a president died, and then he just assumed power from 1884 to 1911. In some ways, this is a very prosperous era for Mexico. It was a period of consolidation, a period of growth, of industrialization, etc. But the gains of this period were not evenly distributed. In much the same way as the Industrial Revolution brought changes to the whole world, but brought about a lot of inequality, the same thing happened in Mexico, but to a higher degree. And there was also a great deal of corruption in the Diaz administration. And again, surprisingly, you see people of European descent rising to the top. So even though the hope of the Mexican War of Independence was that there would be a more even redistribution of land reform, a more even redistribution of wealth and of opportunity and access, instead it became a system of privilege with lighter-skinned, more European descended people at the top, which was against the notion. And so you have a whole collection of people, including Madero, who came and fought against this. Madero was a writer and a revolutionary thinker, and the touch-off point was the election of 1910. And everyone regarded the results of the election in 1910 to have been fraudulent. Porfirio had basically arranged for a puppet to take the position, and that quickly brought about the revolution. But the revolution was not a neat and easy affair. Madero becomes president briefly, but he's assassinated in 1913. And then we're into the throes of a very violent and bloody conflict that lasts for 10 years. But out of this conflict comes some of the most colorful and amazing characters of the era. So you have Pancho Villa, who was the Northern Army, centered in Chihuahua, but down in Oaxaca. You have Emiliano Zapata, who again was a very striking figure, and at times they joined forces. The story of the Mexican Revolution is really complicated. There are shifting loyalties. Eventually, Zapata manages to kind of retire and get out of it. Pancho Villa gets desperate, tries to draw America into the conflict, and General Pershing, Blackjack Pershing, famous general from World War I, actually has to go down to try and stop him. He eventually ends up being executed, not by the Americans, though. The Americans never catch him because in 1917, World War I happens, and Pershing has to go to Europe and kick some can around there. It's very important to know that in many ways the Mexican Revolution in 1910 happened because the promise of independence did not deliver what it expected to, and it is every way far more colorful than any other revolution of the North American continent at the time. Women were keenly involved, and so were mestizos and natives, etc., who were all deeply involved in this. And of course, at the same time in Europe, there was the arrival of some very, very radical ideas, fascism, Marxism, and so you had people in the Mexican Revolution lined up on all sides as well. And into this come three very important artists who are experiencing this change that's happening in Europe, but are also very keen on their Mexican identity and what does it mean to be Mexican, and also on what should be the way going forward. That the initial revolution, I keep confusing terms. The revolution in 1810 is usually referred to as the Mexican War of Independence, and I should be consistent. And the revolution in 1910 is regarded as the Mexican Revolution. So I'll try to keep those terms. I know I'm using them interchangeably and confusing people. But the three players who come to the fore in this, Rivera, Siqueiros, and Orozco, I lost his name for a minute, were all young artists at the time who were being trained in the style at the time, who were captivated. So you see Diego Rivera, I mean, if you think 1913, the independent salons of 1911 was when Cubism first really arrived on the public consciousness, and here is Diego Rivera painting in a style that's really reminiscent of, very, very reminiscent of the styles of Metzinger and Juan Gris and others in Europe. So these artists were right on top of all of the movements. They were very, very cosmopolitan. You can see that in comparing the works of Diego Rivera's architect to the analytical cubism of, say, Picasso in this regard. Here's one of his pieces. Here you can see the wood print. This is very much like the oilcloth being introduced in the analytical stuff. But notice that it also has this little pinned note painted in. This is a detail that he inherits from Zurbaran, that Zurbaran passed this idea down. And so, and the subject matter, of course, the gorilla, Gorilla, I guess I should say, the who had become the champion of the revolution, it's the guerrilla warfare of the Mexican Revolution. So, but from that into the 1920s, 1920 things settle down, and the revolution very strongly shifted things into the direction of the natives and to the native movement. And this is one of the first major commissions that he receives, painted 1922-1923, encaustic and gold leaf. The inspiration of this looks a lot like, say, the murals of the public libraries that, say, Sargent did. So there were a lot of artists doing, kind of large installations like this at the time. It's not that muralism was not something that was kind of native to Mexico. There were lots of people painting murals, but having adopted this form, they made it very purely Mexican. When we look at this, this shows the creation, and a lot of the images, this is Mary Magdalene and other saints, these very much show the European training of Rivera. But when we get to the center figures in particular, even though this is kind of a European seraphim, something about the quality of these characters looks more like nativist art. So here's a kind of explanation of what's going on here. Even though these are kind of identifiable saints and figures, they're kind of separated into the emanations of the spirit of the woman and the emanations of the spirit of man. Figure number 8 here is clearly a reference to images of Mary Magdalene, who grew long hair to cover her body, but here she has been turned into a kind of emblem of charity. And all of these things come together to kind of demonstrate the unity. And so these kind of allegorical figures are probably ultimately inspired by common allegorical scenes that existed in European art. And remember, he did take a trip to Italy. 1920, he went there to study Italian art. But you can see from these early beginnings, he's trying to work out, particularly in these center figures, what should native Mexican art be? And of course, we can't talk about Rivera or any of these guys without talking about Marxism. Remember that this is also the time period of the Russian Revolution. And the Russian Revolution was the first establishment of the first truly Marxist state. A state that, in theory at least, was supposed to be a state of workers, where property was not going to, the means of production were going to be owned by the workers, and through the state, they were going to equally distribute the value of the state instead of exploiting the workers. And there was a lot of fervor and enthusiasm for this movement. Now, we know from history that it quickly devolved into one of the worst totalitarian dictatorships in creation, and that even in the early 1920s, we think of concentration camps and associate those with Nazis, but the concentration camps were first invented by the Soviet Union, by the Bolsheviks. If you don't know the story of the Cheka, the NKVD, the death squads, and the horrible deprivations of the Bolshevik regime, you really ought to educate yourself and take a look at it. We tend to shove that off onto Stalin and blame Stalin for the horrors of that, but it was the reason Stalin rose to the top of the party was because he was better at killing people than anybody else, and even Lenin was dedicated to it. But I think you can forgive the Mexicans for being Marxists. This is something I think you have to realize, that while they went to the Soviet Union They were very impressed, at least, and so were many Americans. I want to point this out. For many, many people living in the 1920s, this is the days of the Weimar Republic, and then, of course, we have the Great Depression after 29. There were times of terrible uncertainty. And so people said, well, okay, obviously, this thing that we call constitutional government, Republican government, free market, capitalist societies, this isn't working. So we need to try something else. And you had Mussolini offering this new vision of this thing he called fascism in Italy. And a lot of people joined that. And then you had Bolsheviks and Lenin trying this thing called Marxism and socialism and communism. And so a lot of people went that direction. The fascism eventually became nationalistic and genocidal. And so for a lot of people, well, the communism was the better choice. And so Diego Rivera and all of them were committed Marxists, absolutely committed Marxists, who were seeking the overthrow of the gentry class, the bourgeoisie, and for restoring the power and the means of production over to state controls so that it could benefit the worker. And this was very influential on him. His trips to the Soviet Union were extraordinarily influential on him. So he comes back to Mexico City and he begins these large series of murals. And he dedicates himself primarily to murals because murals are big. Murals have a presence. Murals give a kind of story. And so he starts painting at the Education Ministry. You can see him here. And it's at this time, not long after, that because of his communist and Marxist interests, he meets up with another communist who was also inspired in this direction, Frida Kahlo. We'll talk more about there. But Frida Kahlo will then continue to figure in his artwork, and she becomes a major model as kind of centers for this. So here we have this, there's no getting around the very heavy Marxist elements of this. We have workers carrying Soviet flags. You see people marching, and you see her as a kind of almost saintly figure distributing boons, but in this case, instead of distributing boons, she's distributing arms. And all of this is very much into this concept of the Mexican Revolution. And so Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera become the center of a group of radicals and Marxists in Mexico City. They become so popular in that regard that when Trotsky is expelled from the Soviet Union by Stalin as a kind of rival to Stalin, Trotsky eventually ends up living in the home of Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. And in fact, he actually starts an affair with Frida. So Trotsky, this high-ranking, communist leader who was one of the great leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution, one of the more communist, it was probably the best writer of the Bolshevik Revolution, winds up and spends his last days in Mexico until eventually Stalin sends an assassin to put an ice axe into his head. Heck of a story. And so we shouldn't be surprised that the themes then are going to be juxtaposing these ideas. Here we have, something that looks like a vault, but also the front of a train. And we have a party, and here they are reading their ticker tape. This is, the elites. Notice that he's using flapper girls and other scenes to demonstrate the emptiness of capitalism. In fact, and not accidentally, notice that the lamp here is the Statue of Liberty. Also notice the champagne. And notice that the style has changed. It has gone flatter. It has gone more stylized. Stylized in a modern way, but also stylized more in a direction towards nativist and native art and folk art. You'll see this especially strong when we get to some of Frida Kahlo's works. And this is, again, the Ministry of Education. And this is another alternative example. This is the death of the capitalist. You can't get any more propaganda than that. It's literally, a person being killed so that they can seize the means of production, that the workers can seize the means of production. There's absolutely no doubt in what he's trying to say here. And he defended all of this. He defended all of it and was very unapologetic, which you have to give him credit for. I have a quote here. He says, Giotto was a propagandist of the spirit of Christianity, the weapon of the Franciscan monks of his time against feudal oppression. Bruegel was a propagandist of the struggle of the Dutch artisan, petty bourgeoisie against feudal oppression. Every artist who has been worth anything has been a propagandist. I want to be a propagandist of communism, and I want to be it in all that I can think, in all that I can speak, in all that I can write, and in all that I can paint. I want to use my art as a weapon. And so you have this amazing history that he develops. Here is a picture of him with Leon Trotsky and André Breton. And so many of these thinkers came together. André Breton, of course, was the founder of the Surrealist movement, and he would influence Frida Kahlo. And so you're going to see all of this come together. And this brings him to the attention of many people, and so he starts painting large, gigantic murals. But the murals have no real ground lines. Instead, they become this melange of characters and scenes that play out. Here in the history of Mexico, we start with the conquest of Mexico. Actually, we have a whole other panel that kind of shows the golden age of Mexico, but we start with the conquest, with the rape of natives and with the fight between the Spaniards and, of course, the Aztecs. But so many things are touched on here, from the Spanish Inquisition and its degradation of natives, also to scenes of revolution. In the center panel here, we see the commemoration of the Mexican War of Independence. So here we have the Mexican War of Independence, and Hidalgo and, of course, Iturbide and others are presented as heroes and champions of the people. And this goes in the next scene, which is right here. I have this scene right here. And this leads directly into the next scene. So he is saying that the initial revolution against Spain is the same revolution that we are fighting today. And so here he puts together a scene, and he shows the Diaz administration, this age as an age of corruption, as well as medals on his chest, as an age against of oil and money interest, against people of ethnic diversity. Notice the people. He puts Zapata and Pancho Villa in there as heroes of the revolution, making sure that everybody is very much aware of this. And then on the other wall, he gives a sense of a kind of golden age that existed. And this is where he takes the story of Quetzalcoatl. This is something that many of the muralists will do, is they'll take the story of Quetzalcoatl. This is Quetzalcoatl Tolpitzin. This is the kind of King Arthur of Mexican myth, the ruler of Tolan, or Tula, who forbade human sacrifice. And you'll notice that he is depicted as a Christ-like figure. And here he is traveling on the back of a serpent to the east, foretelling the time when he will come again. What I love, my favorite scene in this, is the market of Tenochtitlan. So in the market of Tenochtitlan, we have this amazing view of Tenochtitlan and of Aztec industry. The market of Tenochtitlan is actually at Tlacoco, which was an adjacent city to Tenochtitlan. So Tenochtitlan is right here, but it's the island over. And this was the market that the Spaniards absolutely marveled at. And in both extolling the accomplishments of the Aztecs and in style, this is really truly a triumph for native style. You can see his move back to a nativist style. There is so much to read in this. All the different materials, all the different depictions and accurate depictions of things that exist, showing them as ennobling. This is all saying, hey, we had civilization before the Europeans arrived, and we should look back to that. As strange as it may seem, the biggest commissions of the big three were all in the United States. As I said, you would think that America, being the center of laissez-faire capitalism at the time, and also in the 1920s being the center of the the roaring 20s and unbridled capitalism would not have warmed up to this deliberately Marxist kind of worldview, but it turns out not to be the case. Henry Ford, despite being this great magnet of industry, also had a lot of radical ideas and wanted to elevate the status of his workers. He paid what were known as retention wages. That is, he didn't pay minimum wage. He paid wages so that his workers would in fact be loyal to him. And so Diego Rivera is approached to paint a series of murals in what became the Detroit Institute of the Arts, extolling the virtue of Detroit industry. Detroit, by virtue of the car, became one of the biggest cities in the world, and it became that way overnight. It was one of the wealthiest cities in the world, and up until the 1960s, had one of the highest standards of living in the world, in America. Now, Detroit is a kind of an amazing city because its population has fallen to 250,000 in about 20, 30 years, and it's one of the poorest cities in the world. Diego Rivera really liked this idea of industrialism, and this is something they don't tell you about early communists. They were totally in favor of industrialism. In the early 20th century, it was the conservatives who were the environmentalists who say, no, we got to stop the factories, we got to protect the rivers, the mountains, and the streams. I'm recording this on, is it Earth Day? I'm recording this on Earth Day. And this is very ironic, but you need to know this, that in the early 20th centuries, the people who were champions of industrialism were the communists. The communists and the Marxists believed that industrialism would give prosperity and wealth to everyone. This is straight out of Marx. Marx said that the tools of oppression of the working class would be seized by the working class, and then they would use those tools, those very tools that had been used to oppress them, to then give prosperity to everyone. That was the view. And so the Soviet Union and all these early Marxist countries were all about rapid industrialization. So an interesting alliance forms here, that Henry Ford and the Ford Company and Diego Rivera come together to create a mural extolling the triumph of industrialism, which is something that they had in common, that they both believed in this industrial vision. And then, of course, by the time you get to Earth Day, 1970, the whole thing had shifted. That the capitalists had become the conservatives had become completely in favor of unbridled industrialism, and then it was the left, the Marxists, who were like, whoa, we gotta put the brakes on it. So it's interesting how political parties shift. So this is an open air court. Well, not open air, but a large open court. It has a series of panels, and in the upper registers, we have scenes that represent the races of the world, and it also represents raw materials. And then in the lower registers, we have the scenes of the factories themselves. So here you can see it. And Rivera was very explicit about this, that he really wanted the red races, and he actually referred to them as the red race, the black race, etc., as producing things like iron and earth and tin. He analogized the races themselves as the raw materials that industry makes things of. This is all in this idea that all of the races were going to come together to create this industrialist utopia. So we see the raw materials, the ultimate raw materials, as people, and you see the hands grasping the raw materials, and then you see the raw materials themselves, and then you see the people below using the power of industry to turn this into the V8 engine. And of course the V8 engine was the premier engine at the time, and therefore it was the pinnacle of kind of industrial achievement. And so he emphasizes the fire, the flame, and the forging. This is all about human will working together. And notice the races of the workers, that we have black and white and tan and brown and red people all working together to bring these engine blocks, this miracle of industrial might to power. On the other wall, we have the Asian, the yellow races, who of course bring, kind of materials, and you have the white races here and the hands of them as well. You also have these panels that show the advancement of the sciences. And over here we show a massive foundry. Now when we get into this foundry, again, this was one of the largest foundries. This is actually based on a foundry in the Henry Ford plant. And we're going to concentrate on this thing here, because this thing here and its form is patterned after this character here, the statue of Coatlicue. And so people say, how on earth? And again, this idea that the new gods were the gods of industry, and that just like this is a Mother Earth, the kind of creation story, this was the new creation. And he was very explicit about this, that this was his goal. I know this lecture is going a little bit long, but hang with me. We're going to get through this. So this made him internationally famous. It's kind of amazing that all of these artists had enormous success, but they had enormous success in capitalist countries, even though they were all ardent Marxists. It's kind of funny. And that began his next piece, which was Man at the Crossroads. Now, Man at the Crossroads was originally created for Rockefeller Square. Think about that. Rockefeller. Rockefeller is probably the biggest capitalist in the world. And he commissions, Nelson Rockefeller commissions Rivera to create this incredible painting. And the painting is all about, again, the triumph of man over fascism, the triumph of man over the past, and his ability to do so by mastering science. So we have two lenses that kind of focus, and the two lenses show us scenes of the very large, the planets, but they also show us the very small, of microbiology. And we see the world flourishing. And so you have a man here at the very center of the scene, commanding it. He's a worker in overalls and work gloves. He's at the center of all this machinery. A hand holds forth an orb, but the orb has dials indicating the power of the machinery, and the sleeve itself comes out of a manifold. So this is man, by the power of science, making the world a better place and bringing forth this kind of utopia. And then you can see that it gets a little kind of ugly, that over here we have a collection of the people who are, kind of inspired by the science. Young boys and young girls of all ages looking through the lens into the future. And over here we have the workers looking through the lens into the future. But in the background here we have the capitalists, the flappers, etc. And over here we have the forces of the past, the fascists, and their war machine mounted against the workers, united in their liberty, coming together. So this is ardently Marxist. There's no way around it, and you can tell because such a prominent position is given to Lenin, that Lenin here is shown as the direct opposite of these decadent bourgeoisie flappers and communists. And here he is uniting the hands of all races together. Well, this was a step too far. Even for Nelson Rockefeller, he was not about to let Lenin become the centerpiece of a mural in what was the temple of capitalism of Rockefeller, which was built on oil, etc. And so that brought a quick, abrupt halt to the project. And you can see this is one of the few photos of the original mural. The mural I've been showing you was a reconstructed mural done later in Mexico. You can see that it's a little bit different. It isn't as aligned. It's got a little bit different composition. But it's very, very similar. But the painting of Lenin was once too far, and so Rockefeller demanded it come to a halt. You can see that he didn't finish it, and then it was actually completely covered up with a scrim before being painted over. This became the subject of a very important poem, a very funny poem, done in 1933, printed in The New Yorker by E.B. White. Yes, the same E.B. White who wrote Charlotte's Web. I'm going to read the whole poem to you because it's just too fabulous. He says, so this is E.B. White imagining a conversation between Rivera and Nelson Rockefeller. He says, so what do you paint when you paint on the wall, said John Dee's grandson Nelson. Do you paint just anything there at all? Will there be any doves or a tree in the fall, or a hunting scene like an English hall? I paint what I see, said Rivera. What are the colors you use when you paint, said John Dee's grandson Nelson. Do you use any red in the beer of a saint? If you do, is it terribly red or faint? Do you use any blue? Is it Prussian? I paint what I paint, said Rivera. Whose head is that? Whose is that head that I see on the wall, said John Dee's grandson Nelson. Is it anyone's head who we know at all? a Rensselaer or a Saltonstall? Is it Franklin D? Is it Mordaunt Hall? Or is it the head of a Russian? I paint what I think, said Rivera. I paint what I paint what I see, I paint what I think, said Rivera, and the thing that is dearest in life to me in a bourgeois hall is integrity. However, I'll take out a couple of people drinking and put in a picture of Abraham Lincoln. I could even give you McCormick's Reaper and still not make my art much cheaper. But the head of Lenin has got to stay, or my friends will give the bird today, the bird forever. It's not in good taste in a man like me, said John Dee's grandson Nelson, to question an artist's integrity or mention a practical thing like a fee. But I know what I like to a large degree, though art I hate to hamper. For 21,000 conservative bucks, you painted a radical, I say shucks. I never could rent the offices, the capitalistic offices, for this, as you know, is a public hall, and people want doves or a tree in a hall. And though your art I dislike to hamper, I owe a little to God and Gramper, and after all, it's my wall. We'll see if it is, said Rivera. It's a fabulous poem, because this became one of the great fights of, who owns art? Who owns the public space? And of course, Rivera being this ardent Marxist, you could see why he thinks that way. I'm going way over time, but we're just going to roll with it. We're just going to keep going. Because I got to get through this. I need to get you there. So this he received so many more commissions from this. The scandal actually elevated his status both as an artist. And again, I think you can see why I think that the muralists are more than just good. They're important. And so he painted this one, the mural of Pan-American Unity, which was, again, an attempt to connect the needs of many different peoples. So we see a grand tableau that includes the Aztecs here in the upper corner and their integration into society. But he also shows Europeans and also Native Americans from the North American continent. He shows American founding fathers. And he also shows originally American artists. I love the wooden Indian that's being carved here. And above all, of course, he shows the triumph and the progress of industry. At the center of this is a great machine that brings us together, and his wife is there as a kind of emblem. And all of these historical people together. He said of this, he said, only why do the artists of this continent think that they should always assimilate the art of Europe? They should go to the other Americans for their enrichment, because if they copy Europe, it'll always be something they cannot feel, because after all, they are not Europeans. And so the style, the emulation, here he shows Edison and Ford coming together, artists all creating a kind of new world on the continent. And he's actually very sympathetic to peoples of European descent, what he saw as poor Europeans or marginalized Europeans. But here he has, of course, the great revolutionaries of his age. There's going to be Hidalgo and Bolivar again, who pop up once again. But the main emphasis is always on the artists, the crafts, the hands of the individuals as they come forward. Okay, we've gone enough. It's time to go to Siqueiros. So Siqueiros, it's a shame that a lot of his stuff hasn't survived. A lot of his murals have been overpainted, etc. But he in 1922 was also coming to this, condition of looking at native artists and bringing them to the forefront and looking at these primitive styles. I hope you'll notice that when we look at this representation of the elements, that you're seeing the conch shell, and the conch shell being a long-standing emblem of Aztec art and architecture. Probably his most famous painting is going to be Tropical America, which was painted in Los Angeles, which, again, was once part of Mexico. And this became a kind of rallying point for what would become the Chicano movement in the 1960s and 1970s. Here you can see a photo of the original detail, and we see Christ transformed as crucified person, an image of the crucifixion, but transformed into the nativist, kind of idiom. Here you can see him painting it, and here you can actually see an image of it as it would have been seen. It could have hardly be seen from the street, but this was downtown in an area of, again, mixed ethnicity. There were rooftop cafes that people could go up and take a look at it. So it wasn't nearly as inaccessible as you might think. There were places to go. Even though this is a tar paper covered roof, in the barrio, there was a barrio in Los Angeles, a native Mexican a neighborhood where they were still building in traditional Mexican styles, building Mexican style villas and houses. And if you know anything about Mexican style houses and villas, you eat up on the roof because it's cool, it has a breeze, there's not much rain, so they have flat roofs and the roof becomes a kind of place. So this was all part of this. And this was an area that was especially known for being mixed with a lot of different races. Unfortunately, the barrio is now gone. The barrio was absolutely obliterated when they built Dodger Stadium. They bulldozed it. A lot of the Mexican heritage of LA was just utterly destroyed. And so here we see this form like a temple. We see a mixture of characters, both native and a European explorer looking on it. We see chalk mules and native representations. And it shows the conflict pretty much inherent at this juncture point of America, that America was this union of two cultures that came together violently. I think you can see that in a lot of his artwork. This is Echo of a Scream, where we have a kind of head of a child in horror. We have this kind of displaced world that exists. I think he was, and then we have the same head kind of repeated, hence the Echo of a Scream. This is, of course, the rise of the Surrealist movements, and so he moved very heavily towards Surrealism as well. Siqueiros, I think you can also give credit for moving in the direction of psychic automatism, like a lot of Surrealists. This is Collective Suicide, where we have figures depicted here, but it's really a kind of imagined hellscape from the forces of what he would have considered, fascism, etc., coming together. But you can see in this, even in 1936, where a lot of the ideas of psychic automatism and biomorphic surrealism would eventually emerge. Here's another one of his. This is Revolutionary on a Horse. This one is, again, a figure of this incredible dynamic energy. And as always, this one is a fun one. This is Don Porfirio. This is the Diaz, President Diaz, and here you can see at the center, and this is his courtesans. Again, commenting on the nature of how corrupt Mexican society had become before the revolution. And our last one is Orozco. So Orozco, like Rivera and Siqueiros, had a very fiery personality, was also a kind of dedicated Marxist. And I think we'll just spend a little time on his probably most famous work, which again, ironically, is not in Mexico. It's actually in New Hampshire. It's in Dartmouth, and it's in the library. And he was commissioned to paint this in 32 and 34. And it's called The Epic of American Civilization, which is interesting because if you were in America, from a perspective of an American painting this, you would think this would be the epic of the United States of American civilization. But it's always important to know that if you go down to Mexico, they think of themselves as Americans too, because they live on the American continent. America does not have this sole claim to the title America. So it's a massive object that attempts to create not an actual history, but a psychohistory of America and how it had come to be. It's painted in a series of 24 massive panels in the Baker Library Reserve Reading Room. And it's very hard to get a sense of because there's almost no way to photograph it because you can't step back far enough to see it. So the only way to read it is in panels. So we'll start with this wall and go from there. So this wall is the kind of ancient wall. There's an ancient wall and there's a modern wall. And the ancient wall tells the story of Mesoamerican civilization. It starts with this sacrifice scene, but then goes to a scene here which reiterates again this character Quetzalcoatl. And Quetzalcoatl again is depicted very Christ-like, bearded as a white person. So this is kind of an integration of the Quetzalcoatl Tolpitzin myth. Quetzalcoatl becomes the ruler of Tolan, bans suicide, and we see the gods of the old world kind of being subjugated to the new god. We see people dressed in god suits, and we see people laying down underneath the pyramids, and the pyramids are borrowed from the pyramids of the sun. It's a very difficult mural to kind of get through because it actually has to wrap around doorways and existing obstructions. So he really did an excellent job of kind of integrating a whole space, even though it's broken up by so many different obstructions. And this leads us to a kind of scene of the golden age of what life was like in the Mesoamerican world, of artists creating art. He had to work around the vent. Of cultivation, of this high point of civilization. But it ultimately ends with the expulsion of Quetzalcoatl, because, of course, if you know the story of Quetzalcoatl, there's a variety of different stories. He is expelled, and he crosses the sea to the east, whereas Rivera showed him kind of riding across the sky on a serpent. Here he sees him striding across the ocean on the backs of serpents. And Quetzalcoatl then points to a prophecy of his return. So we see the people wailing in front of a pyramid here. This wonderful, almost German expressionistic kind of style. Beautiful style. And the panel that he's pointing to is right over a door frame. You can see the door frame there. And we move from Mesoamerican architecture to European architecture, a Doric column and a kind of, very Hispanic kind of column. And the prophecy he is pointing to, of course, in the tradition of Quetzalcoatl, his prophecy is that he will return. And so he is pointing to the prophecy, and he's returning, but he's returning in the form of war and Christianity and men wearing Spanish armor. Which leads us to the next wall, which is the modern wall, which starts with a panel here. I'm very grateful to whoever put this composite piece together so you can actually see the whole picture. It starts with this panel here, which shows Cortez, and Cortez and the subjugation of the natives. That Cortez's ship arrives, and this is his burning ship. He literally burned his ships to prevent any chance of his men, leaving. And we see the arrival of Christianity and the conquest that is so total and complete. But then this transitions into a scene that has, again, industrial elements. And it's funny, we go right from the conquest practically to the 20th century. And the 20th century scene shows a scene of reform. It shows education reform, and it shows, again, the corrupt regime of President Diaz and the revolutionaries who fought against it. And you have the greedy capitalists kind of consuming gold and going against the wishes of the people. The final scene leads us into a scene that is a parallel to the scene that we saw earlier. So the scene that we saw earlier shows the gods of the old world, that they were gods of fire and of nature. They were bloody gods that required sacrifice. But the new gods are, even though they have this portent to being benevolent gods, are in fact, they're gods as death as much as anybody else. And here we see a birthing scene. Now, this is a college. This is a university. This is Dartmouth. This is one of the most prestigious universities in the United States at the time. And instead, what you see is a birthing scene, but the skeleton is giving birth to a skeleton. And notice that all of these people have mortarboards and academic regalia. I love it. That the gods of the New Age are the Academy, but the Academy produces death just like the old gods did. It's just scathing critique of the modern Academy and modern civilization. And the children that are born stillborn, and they're preserved in jars. And they have little mortarboards, little cute mortarboards on the little fetus, skeletons and preserved. And then they're arrayed on a kind of mountain of books. A total critique of the disposition of modern society. Notice that there's flames behind it. That despite our claims of progress, we still believe in human sacrifice. And you can see that in this scene. This is the scene of Mesoamerican sacrifice, and you can stand in a place where you look to one of the final panels, and the final panels shows the outcomes of the new sacrifice. In this case, you aren't bent over an altar and have your heart ripped out for the gods. Instead, you're sent to fight for a flag and die in a war. These wreaths are wreaths given to the dead. Here's the band playing to commemorate your victory. This is a parody of monuments to unknown or fallen soldiers, and this is a parody of the eternal flame. And he says, yeah, we sacrifice our young men in the factories, and we sacrifice them in the field of war, but don't kid yourself, it's still a kind of human sacrifice to appease new gods, which are the gods of capitalism, etc. And then one of the most powerful scenes in all of this is going to be the scene of this militant Christ. A Christ who is a Christ for the hope for the new era that he hopes to come forward. Behind him you see smashed Greco-Roman columns, you see a mound of weapons, the destroyed weapons. You see a broken Buddha, which is fascinating. That all of the old idols and concepts are destroyed, and Christ is free from his cross, and he chops his own cross down. So it's fascinating that even though we have this person who's clearly Christ, he is not a passive Christ there to be sacrificed. He chops the old system down. He becomes an emblem of liberation of natives, liberation from what we would call the industrial military complex. It's incredibly powerful. And then with this beautiful expressionistic brushwork. Gorgeous stuff. Well, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Frida Kahlo, but I think I'm going to have to stop with her. So, of course, we're famous because she's married to Diego Rivera. She divorces him, marries him again. They both cheated on each other horribly. It was an incredibly dysfunctional relationship, but it became the center of a really important community. Her home, and it was her home, not Diego's home. It was her home outside Mexico City. Is it Coyoacan? I think. Don't quote me on that. That really became the center of intellectual life amongst the artist community and entertained people like André Breton. She gets introduced to André Breton, and this causes her to have an art show. This causes her to embrace surrealism. But she also embraces this nativism. If there's something that's different about her, of course, it's that she really tackles issues of gender and identity. She uses themes and symbols such as monkeys, thorns, hummingbirds, dragonflies, flowers, that are all references to native symbols in her artwork. She suffered from polio as a child, and she also suffered a terrible trolley accident. Did I tell you trolley accidents? Man, there must have been just an insane number of trolley accidents. And this is what causes her to create this work of art called the Column, although I've sometimes seen it called the Shattered Column. And it shows her in her truss with nails in her body representing the pain that she suffered. It also shows that she did have to personally wear a truss after this, but it also shows how this prevented her from becoming a mother. And when you look at the style of this, the primitivism of it, the surrealism, it looks very close to these ex-votos that we saw in the 19th century. She was very famous for painting self-portraits. This is the two Fridas. In this case, you can see their hearts are attached together. She's wearing native dress. She holds in her hand a hat, which is a fedora, which happens to be Diego Rivera's hat. Diego Rivera pops up in her iconography constantly. She holds a forceps, a hemostat to prevent the blood from coming off, but the blood falls on her white dress and it resembles the red flowers. This is all Catholic or native imagery that she's weaving together to create these complex narratives. Is the two-person of who she was. Was she a, her own person, or was she tied to Diego Rivera? This case, she depicts herself in native dress as Tehuana. Tehuana is one of these native people that would dress up in these elaborate floral costumes, creating an icon of herself, but putting a picture of Diego Rivera on her head, representing kind of religious icons or objects that would be painted on foreheads of individuals, and all of this flowers. But the flowers don't, and the lace don't stop. They extend out to creating this kind of strange organic web, which is not part of the costume, is her innovation. I think one of the more revealing is this one, which is self-portrait with cropped hair. This is a line from a song, and it looks exactly like those inscriptions we see on those retablos or ex-votos, those laminas. And it says, "Look, if I loved you, it was because of your hair. Now that you are without hair, I don't love you anymore." and she dresses as a man with her hair cut off. Much has been speculated about her sexual identity, whether she was bisexual or not. This happens right after she divorced Diego Rivera. They later remarried in 1939. But it shows how she played with this idea of sexual identity and how she can, express so much. I love how the hair is spread around. She has these very flat perspectives. And again, everybody comments on the eyebrows, but the eyebrows, facial hair, and you can see a titch of facial hair here, which she often paints. Now, she did have very strong eyebrows, but everybody comments on her eyebrows, but her eyebrows are actually painted stronger than they were in real life. I think let's go back to that photo we had of her. Let's go back to, say, one of the earliest examples. She's got pretty strong eyebrows there. I can't tell in that photo. But in reality, she actually painted her eyebrows stronger than they really were. Because, again, facial hair, you can see the facial hair was kind of a gesture towards masculinity. Native Americans in Mexica did not have much facial hair, whereas Europeans did. So facial hair was kind of a status symbol. And so for someone who is mestiza, they may not have as much facial hair as others. So facial hair in Latino cultures becomes this way of expressing masculinity. So people have always wondered if that's what's behind the eyebrows and the face. Well, I think I've gone way too long. I'm going to have to stop it there. So this is the last lecture. I don't think we can get any further, but I did want to get you into the 20th century. I did want to get you, pretty deep into it, if I could, and kind of explain where we're at. I know I didn't cover much of South America because it's not my area of specialty, but that always leaves room for improvement. So this is the last lecture to be posted. Do take a look at the final announcements. I have made some final announcements, and I think that they'll be very useful for you as we go forward. I am going to post a final study list, but remember that the final, you do not have to remember the identification information, the artist, title, date, period, medium, etc. I'm going to give that for you. What I care more about is that you know the themes and the concepts of the course. The final will drop on Friday. You do not have to take it on Friday. You can take it any time between Friday and April 30th at your convenience. It'll have 5 short answers, 2 comparison and contrast essays, and of course 3 unknowns. Okay. Alrighty. Thanks so much.